I've talked about Selim Berker's idea that in addition to the traditional normative categories of the deontic and the evaluative, we need a third category, the category of the aptic, or the fitting. The idea is that the deontic categories include something like obligatory, permissible, forbidden, and the evaluative includes good, bad, better, worse, best, worst, and so on. The aptic category, the category of the fitting, would include not only fitting and unfitting, suitable and unsuitable, appropriate and inappropriate, but also things like merited and unmerited, deserved, undeserved, and so on. And so there do seem to be some different guiding metaphors here. The deontic, the metaphor is really about constraining you, binding you to something. In the evaluative, it's rather, well, good or bad. And so it's a different kind of thing. And then when we get to the fitting, it's more like fitting a puzzle piece into the appropriate place, having something that matches or fits. Nevertheless, there's a difficulty, and I think we examine that if we look at the tests. His first test is the question of, are there duals? And a number of you in the comments have said, I think these things, these aptics, these fitting ideas, actually do have duals. I'm going to agree with you here. The second thing is, are there polar opposites, where they're extreme ends of a pole, or are there privative opposites, where one is simply not the other? There is a connection between these two, and so I'm going to argue those are really the same test. Let's look at them more carefully. First of all, the question, are there duals? Well, for the deontic, the answer is yes. Obligatory and permissible are duals. So it's obligatory that A is equivalent to it's not permissible that not A. Similarly, it's permissible that A is the dual of obligatory. It's equivalent to it's not obligatory that not A. And so it's very clear that in the strictly deontic categories, there are duals. The evaluative don't seem to have that. And so if we look at good, it's good that A. That's not equivalent to it's not bad that not A, or it's not good that not A. And in fact, it's hard to say what we could fit into that slot that would be something like a dual of good. The same thing is true of bad. It's bad that A. Well, that's not blank that not A. Since both A and not A could be bad, or could be good, it's very hard to see how there could be anything like a dual. And so those distinctions are clear-cut. But when we turn to the aptic, the fitting, it's much less clear. And the second test is, are there polar opposites, where things are at opposite ends of some kind of spectrum? And there can be, of course, then degrees of that. Or is it a matter of things simply being negations of one another, contradictories? Good and bad are contraries. You can't be presumably both good and bad at the same time in the same respect. On the other hand, they're not contradictories. Good is not just not bad. Bad is not just not good. And so we can't simply say they're privative opposites. But on the other hand, forbidden and permissible seem to be privative opposites. To be permitted is just not to be forbidden. To be forbidden is not to be permitted. And so there we have a very clear-cut case. Again, when we turn to the aptic category, the fitting, it may be somewhat less clear. But before I talk about those specifically, I want to observe that they are, in a sense, the same test. Suppose we have privative opposites. Then it is very easy to define a term that is the dual of a given term, provided that, of course, this is something that applies to propositions. It's hard to know what a dual would be if we're talking about a predicate of objects or something like that. But let's talk about something that does apply to propositions. Then we don't have to look very far to see the argument. Let's assume that our terms here allow for the substitution of logical equivalents. So in other words, they aren't hyper-intentional. They don't seem to involve anything like propositional attitudes or other things that would force us to distinguish between things that are really logically equivalent. As long as we don't have anything like hyper-intentionality, then it's easy to show that if we have privative opposites, then we've got a dual. How do we do that? Assume that there is a privative opposite to an operator like x, so that x, a, in other words, it's x that a, is true if and only if it's not y that a. Then we can define some operator z, so it's z that a is just equivalent to it's y that not a. It's going to follow from those two things that it's x that a if and only if it's not z that not a. Okay, so in short, if we've got xa being equivalent to not ya, we can define za to be just y not a, and then we've got xa if and only if not z not a. So for example, it's permissible that a, that's equivalent to it's not forbidden that a. Well, define an operator, in this case it's just obligation, so that it's obligatory that a is equal to it's forbidden that not a. Well, then it follows that permissible that a is equivalent to it's not obligatory that not a. This allows us to take any sort of operator, like obligation, permission, or appropriateness, inappropriateness, etc., and produce a dual. We've got a privative opposite, and so we can define a dual from it. Now we can go in the other direction too. Suppose that x and y are duals. Then using the same trick, we can define an operator z, z of a, equivalent to y of not a, where it follows that x of a if and only if not z of a. So given a dual, we can produce a privative opposite. So really, it turns out that an operator has a privative opposite if and only if it has a dual. Well, that seems straightforward. So what on earth is going on with aptics, with the category of the fitting? According to Berker, these things do not have duals, but they do have privative opposites. Well, unless they're hyper-intentional in some way, that should be impossible. So what's going on? We do have to be careful here, because even though we can technically define a dual, it might be that we don't really have any such concept. And so we don't want to do this in a sort of cheap shot way where we then turn to natural language or to ordinary discourse and find no equivalent to that dual. We might be able to gerrymander a dual, in other words, but if really it's not something reflected in our own conceptual repertoire, then maybe it's not very interesting that we can actually do that. So I think it's important that we show that this isn't just some cheap trick, that we really do have concepts corresponding to this and terms in our language that correspond to something like the dual of fitting or suitable or appropriate or merited or deserved. So let's see if we can do that. Let's consider first the category of the appropriate or inappropriate. We pretty clearly there have privative opposites, so we should be able to construct a dual. Let's see if we can do it. Appropriate that a should be just equivalent to it's not inappropriate that a. Well, that means we should be able to define some operator z of a such that it means it's inappropriate that not a. So it will follow then that it's appropriate that a if and only if it's not z that not a. We'll have a dual. But what could this z be? I don't think it's that hard to come up with it. It just means it's inappropriate that not a. Okay, in other words, it's inappropriate not to do this thing. So do we have a term for that? Do we have a concept for that? Look, if you don't do this, you're really behaving inappropriately. Well, it seems to me we do. It's required. It's expected. It's mandatory. It's de rigueur. It is something that, in this context at least, is expected or required. It's mandatory. So, for example, suppose there's a very fancy restaurant that requires men to wear jackets and ties. Then it would be inappropriate not to wear a tie, inappropriate not to wear a jacket. And so you might say, well then, wearing a jacket is what? It's required, right? It's mandatory, it's expected. And so I think we can do that in general. Recently, President Biden has been in England visiting King Charles. There was a public ceremony, and he walked in front of the king. Now, this created a bit of a stir in the British press. That's inappropriate behavior. You're required to walk either behind the royal family or at best at par with them, but you don't walk in front of them. You don't walk ahead of them. And so you might say that walking ahead of the king, that's inappropriate. And so what is it that you stay at most up on par with the king, but preferably behind the king? That's mandatory, that's required, that's expected. So I think we do have such a concept in this case. It's the concept of being required, being mandatory, being expected. What about the fitting? Well, I think it's the same thing. Is there a privative opposite of the fitting? Well, yes, it's unfitting. And so we can define the dual as simply, well, it's unfitting that not A. So do we have a term for that? It would be unfitting not to do it. Well, then again, it seems to me, it's required, it's mandatory, it's expected. We do have terms for this, and we have a clear concept of this. Certain things are expected, and so it would be inappropriate not to do them. It would be unfitting not to do them. We can do the same thing with suitable. Okay? The dual in this case, since we do have a privative opposite, suitable and unsuitable, would say, well, it's unsuitable not to do something. So think about dress codes in a school or in an office. You might say, look, suppose that something is such that it would be unsuitable not to do it. Well, then it's required, right? It's expected. It is mandatory. So maybe men at the office are expected to wear jackets. Well, then jackets are required. It would be unsuitable to wear clothing that does not involve a jacket. And so I think it is possible in this way to construct things rather easily as duals for appropriate or suitable or fitting. Now it might seem a little trickier when we turn to something like merited or deserved. Did they have duals? Let's consider deserved and its privative opposite undeserved. How can we construct a dual? Well, the idea would be this dual is going to apply to A if and only if what? Well, it's undeserved that not A. So we might think of somebody receiving a certain award, for example. We could say, deserved, well deserved. But now, is there something stronger in this case, we could say, something more powerful, something that would serve as a dual, that would allow us to say, not only did you deserve that, you don't deserve to be overlooked for that. In other words, if you didn't receive it, then that would be a situation that you don't deserve. I think there is. I think there's a distinction between deserving something and having justice require or mandate that you receive it. So let me give you some examples from the history of baseball that I hope will illustrate the kind of distinction I have in mind. First of all, let me turn to the one and only tie in award voting for the most valuable player. It happened in 1979 in the National League, where Willie Stargell of the Pittsburgh Pirates and Keith Hernandez of the Cardinals tied in the voting for most valuable player. If you look at the records that year of both Stargell and Hernandez, they were impressive. Hernandez batted .344, Stargell only .281, but Stargell hit 32 home runs. Hernandez had more RBIs at 105, and far exceeded Stargell in wins above replacement, 7.6. But on the other hand, Stargell was the captain and clear emotional leader of the team that ended up not only winning the pennant, but winning the World Series. And so in this case, you might argue that each of them was deserving. Each person deserved the award, hence the tie, and they were both awarded this. But now I want you to think about what might have happened if one vote had varied. And so one of them ended up one vote ahead and was the sole recipient of the award. You could still say that award was well deserved by that candidate, whether it was Stargell or Hernandez. But would it have been an injustice to the other? Well, it seems like the answer is no. So we could say, yes, deserved. But is it true that it would be undeserved for them not to receive it? I think not, really. I think in that case you could say that other person deserved it too. And so, yes, you deserved the award. On the other hand, is it some kind of offense against justice that you didn't receive it? No. The same thing is true of another case where there was very, very close voting, just a 1-point gap. That happened in 1947 in the American League, between Joe DiMaggio, who won the Most Valuable Player award in the American League, and Ted Williams. It was, in this case, a very close vote for good reason. DiMaggio batted .315, Williams .343, 20 homers for DiMaggio, 32 for Williams, 97 RBIs for DiMaggio, 114 for Williams. Williams also was far ahead in wins above replacement and in OPS plus. I mean, astounding there, 205. That's way, way up there. And so looking at the numbers, you would say, well, wait a minute, Ted Williams should have won the award. He's the one who deserved it. On the other hand, DiMaggio was the leader of the team that ended up winning the World Series in 1947 and was also brilliant defensively. Williams was an adequate fielder, but DiMaggio was one of the greatest center fielders in baseball history. And so looking at that, you could say, well, okay, taking all those things into account, each person deserved that award. Would it have been an injustice, for example, if DiMaggio had not received it, if instead it had gone to Williams? My view is the answer is no. And so in that case, there is a difference between deserving it and having it be utterly undeserved if you don't get it. We can see a clearer example, maybe, of the distinction when we turn to a recent case, the most recent case of a unanimous vote. That happened in 2021, when Shohei Ohtani of the LA Angels ended up unanimously being picked for first place in the American League MVP award voting. Now, taking a look at him versus his runner-up, well, he batted much less, only .257. He did hit 46 home runs, drove in 100 RBIs. However, here's the key thing. He was also a pitcher. And so he went 9-2 as a pitcher. He led the Angels in wins, in starts, in innings pitched. He had a 3.18 ERA and managed to strike out almost 11 batters per 9 innings pitched. And so, in short, he was a first-rate pitcher in addition to being a great power hitter. Well, nobody else could really combine anything like those strengths. He was a clear-cut winner. Now, in this case, I think we can say not only was the award well-deserved, but it would have been an injustice if he hadn't received it. It would have been undeserved that he not receive it, that somebody else receive it. And so in this case, I think we have to say, yes, we have such a concept of the duel. It's something not only deserved, but in this case, it's required by any sense of justice. It would be an injustice if it weren't to happen. And so that idea, I'm not sure we have one word quite that captures that, but we do have the intuitive idea. It's not like, yes, you deserve the award. That's different from saying, wow, you are the right choice, the candidate for that award. It would be an outrage if anyone else were to receive it. That's the duel of deserved or merited, it seems to me. We can see something similar in the 2015 National League Most Valuable Player voting. In this case, too, it was unanimous. Bryce Harper of the Nationals ended up being the first choice of every single voter. Why? Well, he batted .330, 42 home runs, 99 RBIs, 9.7 wins above replacement, a 198 OPS plus. That's astounding. And so he was clearly ahead of the next best candidate, and really any other candidate. So in this case, again, we can say not only did he deserve the award, it would have been an injustice to pick anyone else. It would have been undeserved if someone else had gotten that award. So we might say, in this case, it's not just deserved. Justice required it. It was rightfully his. He was the right choice. So if we want to construct one word for this, maybe it's this. The duel of deserved is rightfully. It was rightfully his. Okay? Meaning it would be undeserved not to have it. Now, I want to leave you with this suggestion. Berker says, to say that the aptics, the category of the fitting, is really deontic, but a special category of the deontic, he says is really just the notational variant of his own view. I'm not sure that's right. There is a strong parallel once we think about the fact that these may well indeed have duals. Why? Well, not only is there a similarity of structure, permissible, forbidden, like fitting and unfitting, or suitable and unsuitable, and so on, but moreover, required, expected, mandatory, de rigueur. That sounds a lot like obligatory. And appropriate, fitting, suitable. That sounds a lot like permissible. So there is a similarity of structure, and moreover, it seems as if, look, if something's appropriate, we're in effect saying that's permitted in this context. If it's suitable, then yes, it's permissible. If it's unsuitable, then no, you shouldn't do it. Okay, it's not permissible. And so I think there's at least a kind of defeasible link between the traditional deontic categories and the category of the fitting. But there is an important difference that we haven't talked about in this video, but I did earlier, which is gradability. Things can be more fitting or less fitting. They can be more suitable, better deserved, or less well-deserved. And that's not true of obligatory, permissible, and so on. So rather than thinking of this as a third category, we might just think of it as the gradable part, as opposed to the ungradable part of the deontic. We could also think that the deontic has this special feature of having privative opposites and duals, whereas the evaluative categories don't. But on the other hand, see obligatory, permissible, forbidden as kind of the simplified redux of the richer category of the deontic that does include gradable concepts like the fitting, the suitable, the deserved, and so on. In any case, all of this is not meant to be conclusive. It just does suggest to me that there are features of these moral categories that are not yet fully explored or understood.